Kansas, spring of 1893. The train pulled away in a cloud of smoke, leaving Clara Bennett standing alone on the weathered wooden platform of Millbrook Station. For a long moment she didn't move. She simply watched the last passenger car disappear beyond the endless prairie until the sound of iron wheels faded into silence. Everything she owned rested beside her: a single leather suitcase, a canvas sack containing kitchen utensils, and a small wooden box that held the only photograph she had of her late husband. She had once believed she would never leave Missouri. Life had been simple there. Not easy but familiar. She and her husband, Thomas, had rented a small cottage where he worked as a carpenter while she earned extra money sewing dresses for neighbors. They never had much, but they always had enough. Then came the fever. It started as a cough during the winter. Within 3 weeks, Thomas was gone. The doctor apologized. The pastor prayed. The landlord wanted his rent. Grief did not stop bills from arriving. By early spring, Clara had sold nearly everything she owned just to survive. The sewing jobs disappeared because wealthier families preferred experienced dressmakers, and there were too many widows searching for work already. One afternoon she noticed a newspaper advertisement offering abandoned farmland in western Kansas at auction. Most people ignored those advertisements. Clara studied every word. The property had belonged to an elderly farmer who died without children. The land had been neglected for years. The house required repairs. The price was astonishingly low because almost nobody wanted it. She spent 2 sleepless nights thinking. On the 3rd morning she sold her wedding jewelry. A week later she became the owner of 40 neglected acres she had never seen. Now she had finally arrived. The station consisted of little more than a depot, a water tower, and a dirt road stretching toward the town. A middle-aged man sweeping the platform looked up. "You must be Mrs. Bennett." Clara nodded. "I am. I'm George Willis. I handle deliveries around here." He glanced at her luggage. "You traveling alone?" "Yes." He removed his cap politely. "I'm sorry for your loss." She managed a quiet smile. "Thank you." George loaded her belongings into a horse-drawn wagon. The ride into Millbrook took nearly 30 minutes. The prairie rolled endlessly beneath a bright blue sky. Fields stretched toward the horizon where scattered farmhouses stood miles apart. It was beautiful. It was lonely. The town itself consisted of one general store, a church, a blacksmith, a feed supply, a small schoolhouse, and fewer than 40 buildings altogether. People noticed strangers immediately. Heads turned as the wagon passed. Some offered friendly nods. Others simply watched. George finally pointed toward a distant hill. "That's your place." Clara followed his finger. Her heart sank. The farmhouse leaned noticeably to one side. Half the porch railing had collapsed. Several fence posts lay scattered across the yard. The barn roof looked as though a strong wind might finish what time had started. George stopped the wagon. "I won't lie to you." She climbed down slowly. "It needs work. It needs nearly everything." He wasn't wrong. The front door barely closed. Dust covered every floor. Several windows were cracked. Rainwater had stained the ceiling. The kitchen shelves hung crooked against the wall. Outside, weeds reached almost to her knees. She walked from room to room in silence. There were only 4 rooms altogether. A kitchen. A sitting room. A tiny bedroom. A storage room barely large enough for another bed. The house felt forgotten. Not abandoned. Forgotten. George carried her suitcase inside. "If you need lumber, nails, or supplies, Miller's General Store has most things." "I appreciate that." He hesitated before speaking again. "People around here have seen others buy this place before." Clara looked toward him. "They usually leave before harvest." After he drove away, silence settled over the farm once more. No voices. No neighbors nearby. Only the steady whisper of prairie wind through tall grass. Clara stood in the middle of the empty kitchen. "This is home now," she whispered aloud. There was no one to answer. She rolled up her sleeves. The first day disappeared into work. She swept years of dust from every room. She scrubbed the kitchen floor twice before the wood showed beneath the dirt. She patched one broken window using old boards she found in the barn. By sunset every muscle in her body ached. She cooked a simple supper over the iron stove. Bread. Beans. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The next morning she inspected the property properly. The well worried her immediately. The bucket scraped the bottom before reaching water. There wasn't enough for crops. The fences were worse. Large sections had fallen completely. If she ever hoped to raise livestock, they would have to be rebuilt. She made a careful list. Repair roof. Clean well. Fix chimney. replace fencing, clear weeds, plant vegetables. Every task required money she barely possessed. At the general store that afternoon, conversations stopped when she entered. The owner smiled warmly. "You must be Mrs. Bennett." "I am. I'm Henry Miller." He gathered the items she requested. Hammer, nails, lamp oil, soap. As he wrapped them, another customer laughed quietly. "The old Harper farm?" Clara nodded. "That's right." The man shook his head. "You'll last a month." Henry frowned. "That's enough, Walter." Walter shrugged. "I'm only being honest." Clara looked directly at him. Honesty isn't always kindness. She paid for her supplies and walked out before anyone could answer. Outside she drew a slow breath. She had expected doubt. She simply hadn't expected it on her second day. For nearly 2 weeks she worked from sunrise until darkness. She repaired loose floorboards. She cleared weeds around the house. She stacked fallen firewood. Her hands blistered. Her shoulders burned. Still she continued. One warm afternoon she struggled to lift a broken fence rail into place. The timber slipped. She nearly fell backward. A cheerful voice interrupted. "That board's heavier than you." She turned. A boy about 8 years old stood beside the road holding a fishing pole. His brown hair stuck out beneath an oversized hat. "I'm Jacob." Clara smiled despite herself. "Hello, Jacob. You need help?" "I'll manage." "You don't look like you're managing." Before she could protest, he grabbed one end of the rail. Together they lifted it onto the fence. "There." He grinned proudly. "My papa says 2 people make hard work easier." Footsteps approached behind him. "Jacob." The boy froze instantly. A tall man crossed the field with calm, steady strides. His clothes were dusty from farm work. His face carried the quiet weariness of someone who spent long days outdoors. "I'm sorry," he said. "I told him not to bother strangers." Jacob looked guilty. "I wasn't bothering." "You were." The man turned toward Clara. "I'm Samuel Carter." "Clara Bennett." He nodded politely. "I've heard you bought the Harper place." "I did." He looked at the broken fencing surrounding the property. "You've taken on quite a challenge." "So I've been told." A faint smile crossed his face. Unlike the others in town, it wasn't mocking. It was respectful. Jacob looked hopefully between them. "I helped." "You did," Clara admitted. Samuel sighed softly. "That's because he rarely accepts the word no." Jacob smiled. "It's true." Samuel reached into his wagon. "I've got leftover fence boards from replacing mine." Clara immediately shook her head. "I couldn't take them. I'm not offering charity." She looked at him carefully. "They're going to be burned otherwise." She remained silent. "If it makes you feel better," Samuel continued, "you can repay me someday." Clara finally nodded. "Then I'll repay every board." "I believe you." He loaded several straight pieces of lumber beside her fence. Jacob waved enthusiastically as they climbed back into the wagon. "We'll come see your chickens when you get some." "I don't even have chickens." "You will." The wagon rolled away. Clara watched until they disappeared over the hill. For the first time since arriving in Kansas, the farm no longer felt completely empty. Someone believed she might actually stay. That evening she used Samuel's lumber to repair another section of fencing. The work continued long after sunset. By lantern light she drove one final nail into place. She stepped back to admire the repaired section. It wasn't perfect. Neither was the farm. Neither was she. But all 3 were standing. Far across the prairie, dark clouds gathered quietly along the western horizon. Clara noticed them. She had no way of knowing that before another week passed, those clouds would bring the storm that threatened to destroy everything she had struggled to build. The wind arrived just after midnight. Clara woke to the sound of shutters slamming against the house with such force that she thought someone was pounding on the walls. Another blast followed. The entire farmhouse shuddered. She hurried from her bed, lit the oil lamp, and looked through the cracked kitchen window. The prairie had disappeared beneath sheets of rain. Lightning flashed across the sky, revealing fence posts bending under the force of the storm. A deafening crack echoed outside. Then another. She pulled on her boots and rushed onto the porch despite the rain. The old oak tree beside the barn had split in half. One enormous branch had crashed through the barn roof. The horses she hoped to buy one day were only a dream, but the barn itself had been one of the few buildings still worth saving. Now part of the roof had collapsed. Rain poured inside. Clara could do nothing except watch. Nature finished in 1 hour what years of neglect had begun. By sunrise the storm had moved east, leaving silence behind. Mud covered the yard. Fence rails were scattered across the pasture. The vegetable garden she had planted only days before had nearly disappeared beneath standing water. She stood in the middle of the destruction, too tired even to cry. For several minutes she simply looked around. Every repair she had completed seemed smaller now. Every step forward had been erased overnight. She quietly whispered to herself, "I can't lose again." A wagon approached along the road. Samuel Carter climbed down before the horses had fully stopped. Jacob and Emma followed close behind. Samuel removed his hat. "I came as soon as I saw the damage." Clara forced a smile. "I've seen worse." He looked toward the broken barn. "No. You haven't." She didn't answer. Jacob stared at the collapsed roof. "We can fix it." Samuel looked toward his son. "We can try." Without another word he picked up a fallen beam and carried it aside. Jacob followed. Emma silently gathered scattered tools that the wind had thrown across the yard. Clara watched them for a moment. "You don't have to do this." Samuel looked back. "I know. You have your own farm. It survived." He lifted another broken board. "Today yours matters more." Something inside Clara softened. Not because someone was rescuing her. Because someone had chosen not to leave her standing alone. The work lasted all day. Samuel climbed onto the damaged roof while Clara handed him replacement boards. Jacob hauled nails and tools with endless determination. Emma swept broken glass from inside the barn without being asked. By evening they had covered the damaged roof with temporary planks and canvas. It wasn't finished, but it would keep the next rain outside. Clara prepared supper using everything she had left. Fresh bread, bean stew, boiled potatoes. The meal was simple, yet no one complained. Jacob declared it tasted better than anything at home. Samuel laughed quietly. "That's because you've worked harder today than you ever have." Jacob proudly nodded. "I know." After supper the children wandered outside. Samuel remained at the kitchen table. He looked around the little farmhouse. "It already feels different." Clara glanced toward the clean shelves and repaired floor. "I've been trying." "I can tell." Silence settled between them. Not awkward silence. Comfortable silence. The kind shared by people who no longer felt like strangers. The following weeks passed with steady work. Samuel returned several afternoons to help strengthen the barn. In exchange Clara mended clothes for his family and helped prepare meals during the busiest planting days. Neither kept careful count. Neither wanted the other to feel indebted. Millbrook slowly began noticing. The widow everyone expected to leave was still there. More importantly, she was succeeding. One Saturday morning Clara loaded baskets of lettuce, onions, carrots, and herbs onto a borrowed wagon and drove into town. It was the first produce she had ever grown on her own land. She arranged everything carefully at the market. Business was slow at first. Then an elderly woman purchased 2 bundles of carrots. Another customer bought onions. Within an hour nearly every basket was empty. Henry Miller smiled as she packed away the last crate. "I think you'll be back next week." "I hope so. You've earned yourself a reputation." "What kind?" "The dependable kind." She smiled. "I'll take that." As summer settled across Kansas, Clara's little farm slowly transformed. The weeds disappeared. Fresh vegetables filled neat rows. The repaired fences stood straight against the prairie wind. Flowers bloomed beneath the front porch where there had once been only dry weeds. One afternoon Emma arrived carrying a basket. "I baked bread." Clara laughed gently. "Your father sent you." Emma nodded honestly. "Yes." Then she hesitated. "I also wanted to see your flowers." Together they walked through the small garden. Emma stopped beside a row of white daisies. "My mother liked flowers." Clara remained quiet. After a moment she asked softly, "What was she like?" Emma smiled sadly. "She always sang while cooking." "What did she sing?" "I don't remember." She looked down at the flowers. "I only remember that she sang." Clara knelt beside her. "You don't have to stop remembering her." Emma looked surprised. "I know. You never replace someone you love." The little girl nodded slowly. "I think you'd understand." Clara smiled. "I think I would." As harvest season approached, Samuel found himself visiting Clara's farm more often than necessary. Sometimes he brought tools. Sometimes spare seed. Sometimes he simply happened to ride past. Neither mentioned the obvious. Jacob certainly did. One afternoon while helping stack firewood he announced, "Papa smiles more now." Samuel nearly dropped an armful of logs. "Jacob." "What?" "You don't have to say everything you think." Jacob frowned. Why not? Clara laughed quietly. Samuel rubbed the back of his neck. Because some thoughts belong inside. Jacob considered this. I don't think mine do. Emma sighed. They never do. Autumn arrived with cool mornings and golden fields. One evening Samuel invited Clara and several neighbors to a harvest supper. The gathering filled the Carter farmhouse with laughter. Children chased one another outside. Neighbors shared stories from previous harvests. For the first time in years Clara forgot she had once been lonely. She simply belonged. Near sunset a well-dressed man approached the gathering. His name was Edward Collins. He owned one of the largest farms in the county. He had recently lost his wife and had no children. He greeted Clara politely. I've heard remarkable things about your farm. She thanked him. I admired determination. Over the following weeks Edward visited several times. He was generous, successful, well-respected. Eventually he spoke plainly. I believe we could build a comfortable life together. The proposal surprised Clara. Edward promised security, a larger house, more land, a future free from financial worry. Many women would have accepted immediately. Instead Clara asked for time. That evening she sat alone on her porch watching the sunset. She thought about security. She had once believed safety was the same as happiness. Life had taught her otherwise. She remembered the storm, the broken barn, the people who had come without being asked. Not because they expected something in return. Because they cared. Money could build a house. Could not create that. The following afternoon Samuel arrived carrying a repaired wagon wheel. He noticed her thoughtful expression immediately. Something's bothering you. She told him everything. He listened without interruption. When she finished he looked toward the distant fields. I can't promise wealth. I know. I can't promise life will always be easy. I know. He took a slow breath. But I can promise you'll never carry every burden alone again. She looked at him. I've spent 3 years trying to be enough for Emma and Jacob. His voice remained calm. I've managed. He paused. But managing isn't the same as living. He met her eyes. I don't need someone to replace my wife. Clara waited. I need someone I can build tomorrow with. The prairie became perfectly still. Even the wind seemed to stop. I don't know exactly when it happened, Samuel continued. Maybe the day you refused charity. Maybe the day you stayed after the storm. Maybe the first time Emma laughed again. He smiled gently. But somewhere along the way this stopped feeling like helping a neighbor. It started feeling like coming home. Tears filled Clara's eyes. Not from sadness. From relief. Someone finally understood the loneliness she had carried for so long. She reached for his hand. I have an answer. He waited quietly. I don't want the safest future. She smiled through her tears. I want the truest one. Samuel's smile was small. But it carried more happiness than words ever could. Jacob's voice suddenly echoed from behind the barn. I knew she'd say yes. Emma covered her face. I told you not to listen. The two children stepped out from behind the corner looking thoroughly embarrassed. Samuel laughed for the first time in months. So you've both been spying? Jacob shrugged. Only a little. Clara knelt beside them. I suppose this means you've both been planning something. Emma nodded shyly. We hoped. Several months later, on a bright October morning, the little church in Millbrook filled with neighbors. There were no expensive decorations. No grand celebration. Only family, friends, and people who had watched two lonely lives slowly become one. Jacob proudly carried the wedding rings. Emma arranged fresh flowers picked from Clara's own garden. When the ceremony ended, the entire town applauded. Even Walter, the man who had once predicted Clara would leave within a month, shook Samuel's hand. I was wrong. Samuel smiled. People can be. Years passed. The neglected farm became one of the finest in the county. The vegetable fields expanded. The barn stood stronger than before. Children's laughter filled both houses until they eventually became one home. Emma grew into a kind schoolteacher. Jacob inherited the farm his father had spent a lifetime building. Every spring Clara planted white daisies beneath the porch. Every autumn Samuel repaired fences before the first snow, even when they no longer needed repairing. One quiet evening, many years after stepping off that lonely train, Clara sat beside Samuel on the porch watching the sun disappear beyond the Kansas prairie. She remembered arriving with one suitcase, a broken heart and little hope. She had believed she was buying abandoned land. Instead, she had found something far more valuable. A place where kindness arrived without being asked. A home built on trust instead of necessity. And a family that proved the richest harvest in life is never measured by the crops growing in the field, but by the people waiting beside you when the work is done.